Hi, everybody. So today we're meeting to talk about our next set of notes, and it's going to be tea time. So before we go ahead and get started, make sure that you have your notes out on a different tab so you can be following along with your PowerPoint. You can stop this whenever you need to pause and get your notes figured out. Make sure that you get those finished up and turned in so that you're not having missing assignments and falling behind. If you do have questions, just let one of us know. Send us a message and we'll get on top of that and figure out how we can help you with that. Okay, so we are going to be starting with tea time. So it is now time for tea. We're talking about the Tea Act. So this picture is depicting some colonists throwing tea into the Boston Harbor. They are dressed as Indians, as you may notice. The Tea Act was in 1773. It was put in action by the British East India Company. They were allowed to ship their tea straight to the colonies instead of like sending it somewhere else and having the colonies get it from them. So the British government controlled the entire process there. They set it up so that they were going to cut out the middleman, which made it easier financially for them, but it kind of shook things up for the colonists in a way that they didn't expect. So because they were cutting out the middleman, it ended up lowering the cost of tea, and it gave them a monopoly. So they kind of cornered the market on tea. What that meant was that they were controlling the entire tea market, and our little monopoly man is up here in the corner to represent that. So the way that this hurt the colonists is actually the tax got lower. So you would think that that would be beneficial, but because they had been previously smuggling tea, there had already been a tax on the tea. They were avoiding that for a certain period of time, and now that the cost was so low, there was no reason to buy tea from someone who had smuggled it for cheaper because the cost was already low enough and that it wouldn't really make sense to do it that way. So now we're going to take a look at supply and demand. With the supply, if they have what you need, they can charge what they want. So if the British East India Company had the tea and they were the only ones who had access to it, it was going to be up to them to decide how much that you're going to pay for it. The other thing before we get the cart ahead of the horse is that while it upset the colonists that they couldn't smuggle tea, the other part that they were starting to get worried about is like if they could tax their tea, then they could put that tax on anything else too. So in this case, it was, I'm sure you've heard the phrase taxation without representation. That meant that they were worried about the government of Britain making these big decisions without including colonists in the decision. There wasn't a colonist who got to give their input on that taxation process. So that was the bigger issue with taxing their tea. Also, they just really liked tea, and it was kind of offensive. So when we're looking at supply and demand, demand is who wants a product, how much is wanted. And then supply is how much of something you have. If the demand falls, supply rises, then the price is going to fall. If the demand rises and the supply falls, the price is going to rise. So in our example, we're going to compare two very different things. So if everyone has gold in their backyard, the value isn't going to be very high because the supply is really high and the demand is low. Because if you can walk out in your backyard and just go grab it, why would you want mine? But if I'm the only one who has the gold and everybody wants gold, then I can charge you whatever I want for it. That would make a low supply and high demand. But if I have 800 tons of dog poop in my backyard, there's going to be high supply and a low demand. It doesn't matter how much I have, even if none of you have dog poop, nobody's going to want mine. So the supply and demand have to work together to come up with what the price is going to be. Now let's take a look at the Boston Tea Party. So first, this is a really famous, infamous picture. So when you look at this picture, a couple things stick out to me. First of all, this picture is propaganda. So it was made after the fact to kind of shape how the British and the colonists viewed this whole situation. When the Boston Tea Party actually happened, there wasn't a big crowd. Also, it was in the middle of the winter and there's no snow. They don't depict that. They kind of made it up as they went to show you what they wanted to see on this one. So when it depicts this inaccuracy, it kind of makes you wonder what message they were trying to send. So a group called the Sons of Liberty tried to stop the unloading of the tea. So when the tea was sent this way, they did not want it to come off of the ship. They were not interested in that. And so we have some fellas here trying to prevent that. So these are the Sons of Liberty. And then in December 16th of 1773, a group of men were disguised as Native Americans and they dumped a bunch of tea into the Boston Harbor. I think it was around like 340 big tea chests, and those had to be heavy. But the real question is, like, why would they dump it? They love their tea, but it was kind of a statement, like, we don't have to deal with that. We're not putting up with it. So they made their statement by dumping it into the Boston Harbor. The other question that I had when I was looking at this is, why would they dress as Native Americans? Well, in this case, they were actually kind of mocking the British government in a couple ways. So there was a proclamation in 1763 that had tightened control over expansion and kind of like set a boundary between the colonists and the Native American population. But the colonists weren't so fond of this proclamation either. And so they dressed up as Indians to be like, yeah, we'll do what we want. We'll go where we want. And they kind of set the statement that they're no longer British subjects. They didn't want to be seen as one of them. They're not going to dress up the way that they dress. And there was some aspect of like it disguising their, like the individuals too. But for the most part, it was kind of like a big take that to the British government. So after all of this, the British reaction, they was angry. They were not happy. And in turn, you're going to see the British double down. They do not like the colonists deciding that they're going to do things on their own. So the way that they started to double down was they began with the Intolerable Acts. So here we see a picture of what looks like how they're treating the colonists. They've got Boston locked up. They're not treating them super well. Britain passed 41 laws that pretty much were in backlash to the Boston Tea Party. They locked everything down. They made it a lot harder for the colonists because they kind of wanted to squash any rebellion that was going on at the time. So they kind of closed up the port, so there was no trading. Then the royal governor was given more power over the colonists, which was not something that they were looking for. They cut legislative power in colonies, so the lawmaking branches that were in the colonies were now pulled back. And then they strengthened the Quartering Act. So we talked about the Quartering Act in the past where soldiers ended up staying with colonists or wherever the British wanted them to be, and now that's intensified. So the colonists are not happy about that. And there were a couple other major intolerable acts too, but these are just some of the important ones. Another thing that they did was that they passed the Quebec Act. So that pretty much gave land to Canada between Ohio and Missouri, between the Ohio and Missouri rivers, excuse me, and it put kind of a blockade for the colonists so that they couldn't really move west. So putting a stop on colonial expansion again. And you can kind of see that here where the 13 colonies are, and then like where Quebec is then. And then you'll have your American reaction. Oh no, you didn't. So this little, I believe is an ostrich, maybe, kind of represents the colonists. They were like, no, thank you. That is not how this is about to go. So first, the colonies kind of rallied around Boston. So it started to kind of pull Americans together because they started to supply help for Boston. Like in this picture, it's talking about fighting for liberty, banding together. And then the First Continental Congress was formed. So these fellas got together and they started to kind of have these broader goals. They began kind of working together like all of the colonies, and they wanted to meet to repeal the Intolerable Acts. And that was like their major goal, clearly. But then they also created militias and they called for a boycott. So once they got their militia together, that's kind of like a standing army where they have a force that can actually fight the British. And then, like I said, the British goods boycott. So they had already kind of been boycotting the tea, but now they're calling for even more of that. And then we'll have John and Sam Adams, John Jay, George Washington, and Patrick Henry, as you can see here. So the question after all of that, they're starting to kind of move towards more of like a togetherness in the colonies. So what happens next? Are we looking at a war? Are there going to be treaties? What about boycotts? So everyone should kind of think for a second. What do you think is next? Without looking it up, because clearly in history, we know what comes next. But what do you think would happen next? How would you have sent a message to the British? What would you have done to kind of would take your stance? So just be mindful as you start working on those notes and filling everything out. What comes next after all of this? All right, guys, so make sure you send us your questions. If you need anything, make sure you finish those notes up and get them sent in. Have a great day. Thank you. Bye.